Close your eyes and imagine water. Not the gentle rain that waters your garden, or the peaceful stream that flows past your home. Imagine water rising higher than the tallest building you've ever seen. Water covering mountains. Water swallowing entire cities. Water that doesn't stop rising until the whole world disappears beneath it. Tonight, you're about to discover the most incredible survival story ever told. A story of one family who built the impossible when everyone called them crazy. A story of animals walking 2 by 2 towards salvation. A story of 40 days and 40 nights that changed everything. But here's what most people don't know about Noah's flood. It wasn't just about rain. It wasn't just about animals. It was about a choice that would determine who lived and who died. And tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, you'll uncover secrets that have been hidden in this ancient story for thousands of years. If you're new here, welcome to our community of nighttime explorers. Hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And those of you who've been with us before, give this video a like if you're ready for a journey that will keep you thinking long after your eyes close. Now, let me ask you something that might surprise you. What if everything you thought you knew about Noah's flood was wrong? What if there were details so shocking, so controversial, that they've been overlooked for centuries? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll discover why some scientists believe Noah's flood actually happened. You'll learn about the mysterious sons of God mentioned in the Bible and the terrifying reason God decided to wash the world clean. And later in our story, I'll reveal the one mistake Noah made after the flood that changed the course of human history forever. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Our story begins not with rain, but with something far more disturbing. Picture the most beautiful place you've ever seen. Rolling green hills stretching to the horizon. Crystal clear rivers winding through forests where every tree bears fruit. Mountains that seem to touch the clouds themselves. The air is so pure you can taste the sweetness in wives. Who were these sons of God? Some believe they were angels who abandoned their heavenly home. Others think they were the descendants of Seth, the righteous line that had fallen into sin. But here's what everyone agrees on. Whatever happened created giants. The Bible calls them Nephilim. Warriors so powerful, so feared, that their very existence terrified ordinary people. These weren't just tall humans. These were beings of incredible strength and violence who ruled through fear. Can you imagine living in a world like that, where might made right, where the strong took whatever they wanted from the weak, where justice was just a word, and mercy was seen as weakness? Now, before we continue, I want to ask you, have you ever lived through a time when the world felt broken, when evil seemed to be winning, when you wondered if good people still existed? Drop a comment and let me know. We're building a community here, and your stories matter. The violence grew worse each day. Cities became battlegrounds. Families turned against each other. Children learned to lie before they learned to love. The very hearts of people had become only evil all the time. That's exactly how the Bible describes it. But there was one man who was different. And that's where our story really begins. Because in a world gone completely wrong, God found one person who still remembered what right looked like. One person who still listened when heaven spoke. One person who would become humanity's last hope. Coming up next, you'll meet this extraordinary man and discover why God chose him above everyone else on earth. But first, let me tell you something that will blow your mind. The name Noah actually means comfort or rest. His parents had no idea they were naming the man who would give the human race a chance to start over. Stay with me, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about ordinary people doing impossible things. His name was Noah, and he was 600 years old when his world ended. Think about that for a moment. 600 years. He had watched 20 generations come and go. He had seen the slow decline of everything good and beautiful. He had witnessed humanity's fall from grace happen one choice at a time, one generation at a time, until the world around him was unrecognizable from the paradise it once was.
Up in a world that was a little more broken than the day before. Every day, he would choose to do right when everyone around him was choosing wrong. Every night, he would pray to a God that the rest of the world had forgotten. And God was watching. You see, God hadn't given up on humanity. He was looking for someone, anyone, who still cared about truth, about justice, about love. Someone who could be trusted with the future of the human race. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He had a wife whose name we're never told, but who stood by his side through everything that was coming. He lived simply, worked hard, and treated everyone around him with kindness, even when they didn't deserve it. But then something happened that would change everything. One day, as Noah was going about his ordinary life, God spoke to him. Not with a thundering voice from the sky, but with words that filled his heart and mind with perfect clarity. "The end of all flesh has come before me," God said. "The earth is filled with violence, and I will destroy both them and the earth." Can you imagine how Noah felt in that moment? The God of the universe, the creator of everything, was telling him that the world was about to end. Every person he had ever known, every place he had ever been, all of it would be washed away. But then came the most incredible words Noah had ever heard. "But with you, I will establish my covenant." You, not the kings with their armies, not the giants with their strength, not the rich with their treasures. You, Noah. You who have been faithful when faithfulness seemed pointless. You who have been righteous when righteousness was ridiculed. Now here's something most people miss about this story. God didn't choose Noah because he was perfect. The Bible makes it clear that all have sinned. Noah was chosen because he was faithful, because when everyone else gave up on God, Noah never gave up. And that's a truth that should give us all hope. God doesn't choose the perfect people. He chooses the faithful ones. If you're listening to this tonight and you feel like you're not good, others received the same message but chose to ignore it, stay tuned, because that possibility might change how you see this entire story. Build a boat, Noah. Make it 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. Those were the exact measurements God gave Noah for the ark. And if you think those numbers don't sound impressive, let me put this in perspective for you. The Titanic was 882 feet long. Noah's Ark was more than half the size of the most famous ship in history. But here's the difference. The Titanic was built in a massive shipyard by thousands of workers using the most advanced technology of 1912. Noah was told to build his ark on dry land, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, with just his family to help him. Oh, and one more small detail. Boats this size didn't exist in Noah's time. No one had ever built anything like it. No one even knew it was possible. Can you imagine what went through Noah's mind when God gave him these instructions? But the size wasn't even the craziest part. God also told Noah exactly what this massive boat was for. "I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it will perish, but you and your family will enter the ark. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal. Also take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. This is to keep them alive throughout the earth after the flood." Let me pause here and ask you something. If someone came to you today and said, "God told me the world is going to flood,
and I need to build a massive boat to save all the animals. What would you think? Be honest. You'd probably think they needed professional help, right? But Noah didn't question. Noah didn't argue. Noah didn't ask for a second opinion. The Bible simply says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Think about the faith that required. Think about the trust. Noah was about to spend years of his life, all of his resources, and all of his family's energy on a project that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. But here's something fascinating that most people overlook, and the mockery was brutal. Can you picture it? Every day, people would come from miles around just to laugh at the crazy old man building a boat in the desert. They would point and whisper. They would bring their friends to see the lunatic who thought the world was going to flood. "Where's all this water supposed to come from, Noah?" they would shout. "How are you going to get that thing to the ocean? What happens when you're finished and nothing happens?" Day after day, year after year, the laughter never stopped. But Noah never stopped building. Now here's where our story gets really controversial. Some scholars believe Noah wasn't just building an ark during those 100 years. They believe he was also preaching, warning people about the coming judgment, giving them a chance to repent and join him in the ark. If that's true, then Noah spent a century not just building humanity's rescue ship, but also serving as God's final messenger to a doomed world. Can you imagine the heartbreak? Spending 100 years warning people who wouldn't listen. Watching neighbors, friends, maybe even extended family members choose mockery over salvation. But whether Noah preached or not, his life was certainly a sermon. Every day he worked on that massive boat was a testimony to his faith in God's word. Every hammer blow was a declaration that God could be trusted, even when his commands seemed impossible. And slowly, plank by plank, the ark took shape. If you're encouraged by Noah's faithfulness in the face of ridicule, go ahead and share this video with someone who needs to hear about trusting God when nothing makes sense. Coming up next, you'll discover how Noah's own family struggled with doubt and the moment when everything changed. You'll learn about the supernatural event that convinced even the skeptics that something extraordinary was happening. But first, I have to tell you about the one thing that could have destroyed the entire project. The one moment when Noah's faith almost broke under the pressure. Stay with me, because what happened next reveals something profound about God's character. Year 50 of construction. Noah's hair had gone completely grey. His hands were permanently stained with pitch and scarred from decades of working with rough. The earth had spoken to him, and Noah would not doubt that voice, no matter how circumstances looked. "It will rain, my son," Noah said simply. God has promised it, and God keeps his promises. But doubt wasn't the only enemy Noah faced during those long years of construction. There was the practical problem of resources. Do you have any idea how much wood it takes to build a 450-foot boat? Noah had to cut down thousands of trees. He had to shape millions of boards. He had to gather tons of pitch to waterproof the entire structure. Where did all these materials come from? The Bible doesn't give us the details, but we can imagine Noah trading everything he owned, calling in every favor, working deals with merchants who thought he was crazy, but were happy to take his money. Then there was the problem of expertise. Noah wasn't a shipbuilder, he was a farmer. He had to learn carpentry, engineering, architecture, and animal husbandry, all while managing the biggest construction project in human history. But perhaps the hardest challenge was the loneliness. As the years passed, even Noah's supporters began to have second thoughts. Old friends stopped visiting. Business partners found excuses to work with others. Noah and his family became more and more isolated as their strange project consumed their lives. There were moments, dark moments,
when Noah wondered if he should just stop. Maybe he could salvage some of the wood, sell what he could, and try to live a normal life for whatever years he had left. But every time doubt crept in, something would happen to strengthen his faith. Sometimes it was a dream that reminded him of God's promise. Sometimes it was an unusual weather pattern that seemed to hint at what was coming. Sometimes it was simply the inner peace that came from knowing he was doing exactly what God had asked him to do. And then there were the animals. Starting around year 75 of construction, something strange began happening. Wild animals started appearing near the building site. Not to attack or hunt, but just to watch. Peaceful, almost curious, as if they were waiting for something. Birds would perch on the growing frame of the ark and sing. Deer would graze calmly nearby, unafraid of the human
way into safety, one entrance into salvation. Everyone who wanted to live would have to come through that one door. But as the ark neared completion, Noah faced his greatest test yet. The mockery had never been worse. What had started as gentle teasing decades earlier had turned into cruel harassment. People would throw rocks at the workers. They would sabotage tools and materials. Some even threatened violence if Noah didn't abandon his insane project. Why the escalation? Because deep down, something about the ark scared them. Not the boat itself, but what it represented. The possibility that Noah was right. The possibility that judgment was coming. The possibility that they were wrong about everything. People don't usually get that angry at something they think is completely harmless. Noah's family felt the pressure too. His sons' wives had given up most of their friendships. His grandchildren were mocked at the market. The family name had become a joke throughout the region. But Noah pressed on, day after day, board after board, year after year. And then, in year 99 of construction, something happened that changed everything. If this story of persistence against impossible odds is speaking to your heart, let your friends know by sharing this video. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Coming up, you'll witness the moment when the impossible became undeniable. You'll see how God vindicated Noah's faith in the most spectacular way imaginable. And I'll reveal the detail about what happened next that most people completely miss. But first, here's a question that might change how you see your own struggles. What if God allows us to face seasons of doubt and opposition, specifically to prepare us for the miracles He's planning? Stay tuned, because what happens next will blow your mind. Year 100. The ark stood completed. For a century Noah had worked. For a century he had endured mockery. For a century he had trusted God's promise, when everything around him suggested that promise would never come true. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that seemed no different from any other, the miracle began. Noah was checking the pitch seal around the door when he heard harmony toward the same destination. Lions walking peacefully beside lambs, wolves traveling calmly with sheep, hawks soaring overhead, while rabbits hopped below, and none showed any fear of the others. It was as if God had temporarily suspended the natural order, replacing the law of survival with something else entirely, the law of salvation. The townspeople who had come that morning to continue their daily ritual of mocking Noah fell silent. Jaws dropped, fingers pointed. Whispered conversations stopped mid-sentence as thousands of animals continued streaming toward the impossible boat. "How is he doing this?" someone whispered. "It's witchcraft," another replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep in their hearts, they all knew the truth. This wasn't magic. This wasn't trickery. This was something far beyond human power or understanding. This was God keeping His promise. For 7 days the animals came,
2 by 2 of most species, 7 pairs of the clean animals that would be needed for sacrifices and food. Birds filled the sky in organized formations. Insects arrived in coordinated swarms. Reptiles slithered in orderly processions. Even sea creatures appeared, seals and otters and water birds that would need the Ark's protection during the catastrophic changes coming to the oceans. Noah and his family worked frantically to guide each species to its designated area. The Ark's 3 decks had been carefully planned for this moment. Large animals on the bottom for stability, medium-sized creatures on the middle deck, birds and small animals on the top level, where the windows provided the most light and air. But the most amazing thing wasn't the organization, it was the behavior. Natural enemies that should have been fighting to the death were lying down peacefully side by side. Carnivores showed no interest in hunting. Prey animals showed no fear. It was like getting a glimpse of paradise itself. The crowds watching grew larger each day. People traveled for miles to witness the gathering. Some still mocked, but their laughter was nervous now, uncertain. Others watched in stunned silence. A few began to wonder if they should ask Noah if there was room for them too. But they never asked. Noah took one last look at the world he was leaving behind. The world that had rejected God's warning. The world that had chosen mockery over repentance. The world that was about to discover that God means what he says. Then something happened that sent chills down the spine of every person watching. The door of the Ark began to close. But Noah wasn't closing it. None of his family members were near it. The massive wooden door was swinging shut by itself, sealing the 8 survivors inside their wooden refuge. The Bible puts it simply: the Lord shut him in. God himself closed the door between the saved and the lost, between those who had heeded the warning and those who had ignored it, between life and death. And in that moment, the laughter stopped. The mockery died in people's throats. Because suddenly, everyone watching realized that this wasn't a game anymore. If this miracle of the animals gathering is giving you chills, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about God's timing. Sometimes he waits until the very last moment to reveal his power, but he's never late. Coming up next, you'll experience the terror of the first raindrops and discover what it was like for those left outside when they realized their mistake. You'll learn about the supernatural forces that were unleashed and why even Noah was terrified by what happened next. But first, here's something most people never consider. What if those 7 days when the animals were gathering were God's final warning to humanity? What if he was giving people one last chance to see his power and choose to believe? The implications of that possibility are staggering. 7 days passed. 7 days of eerie silence after the door closed. 7 days when the world held its breath. 7 days when the people who had spent decades mocking Noah began to feel the first cold fingers of doubt creeping into their hearts. Inside the Ark, Noah and his family waited. They could hear the animals settling into their new homes, the soft lowing of cattle, the gentle bleating of sheep, the rustling of countless birds finding their perches. But outside, nothing but an unnatural quiet. When will it start? Give. Others took a different approach. They began to prepare, just in case. A few families started gathering food and fresh water. Some men began looking for higher ground where they might build temporary shelters. But most people pushed these precautions aside quickly, embarrassed by their own fears. After all, how could the entire world flood? It was impossible, ridiculous. The ravings of an old man who had clearly lost his mind. But then came the morning of the 8th day. It started with a single raindrop. Not unusual in itself. Rain was a normal part of life, even if it wasn't common in that region. But this raindrop was different. Larger than any raindrop should be, and it struck the ground with a sound like a small bell ringing. Then came another, and another. Within minutes, drops were falling steadily from a sky that had been perfectly clear just moments before. People looked up, confused. Clouds were forming out of nothing, gathering with supernatural speed, blocking out the sun. But the rain wasn't the only thing happening. Deep beneath the earth, something was stirring. Springs that had been dry for generations began to bubble up with water. Wells that had never run dry began to overflow. Cracks appeared in the ground, and from these cracks came torrents of water under tremendous pressure. The Bible describes it perfectly. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. This wasn't just rain. This was the unleashing of waters from above and below. A catastrophe beyond anything the world had ever seen or would ever see again. Within hours, what had started as a gentle shower became a downpour. What had been a downpour became a deluge. What had been a deluge became something for which there was no name. Water fell from the sky in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Water erupted from the ground with the force of geysers. Springs became rivers. Rivers became floods. And the floods began to rise. The first people to panic were those living in the valleys. They had always known that low-lying areas could flood during heavy rain. Others built makeshift rafts, but these were quickly destroyed by the supernatural forces at work. A few groups tried to build their own arks, but there wasn't time, and they lacked the divine blueprints that had made Noah's vessel seaworthy. Can you imagine the desperation, the terror, the overwhelming regret? These were people who had heard the warning. They had seen the evidence. They had watched the animals gather and the door close by itself. But they had chosen to ignore all of it, and now they were facing the consequences of that choice. If you're listening to this story tonight and feeling the weight of its warning, take a moment to comment below. Sometimes, we all need reminders that God's patience has limits, even though His love never does. The rain continued for exactly 40 days and 40 nights, just as God had promised. But the waters kept rising for 150 days total, until every mountain peak on Earth was covered by at least 22 feet of water. Every living thing that breathed air died. Every person who had mocked Noah's faith. Every animal that hadn't found refuge in the ark. Every bird that hadn't been called to safety. All of it was gone, swept away by the flood that everyone had said could never happen. Except for 8 people and the animals floating safely in a wooden boat that had taken 100 years to build and 7 days to fill. Coming up, you'll discover what life was like inside the ark during those terrifying months. You'll learn how Noah's family survived psychologically when they were literally the only humans left alive on Earth. And I'll reveal the one thing that happened inside the ark that proved God was still watching over them. But first, here's a sobering thought. The Bible says that in the last days people will be eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the moment of judgment, just like in Noah's time. Are we living in such a time right now? The parallels are remarkable. Inside the ark, Noah pressed his ear against the wooden wall and listened to the world dying. For the first few days of rain, they could still hear voices outside, shouting, screaming, desperate pleas for help that Noah was powerless to answer. The door had been sealed by God Himself, and only God could open it. Becoming buoyant, beginning to float, The sensation must have been terrifying and miraculous at the same time. Noah felt the ark shift beneath his feet and knew there was no going back now. They were committed to this journey, wherever it might lead them. Inside their floating refuge, life took on a rhythm unlike anything they had ever experienced. 8 people, sharing living space with representatives of every animal species on Earth. The sounds were incredible, a symphony of bleats, roars, chirps and growls that never completely stopped, day or night. But here's what's amazing. There was no chaos. Despite being confined together in what must have felt like the world's strangest zoo, predators showed no interest in hunting. Prey animals displayed no fear. The supernatural peace that had marked the gathering continued throughout their voyage. Still, caring for all these creatures was an enormous task. Noah and his family had to provide food and water for thousands of animals, clean their living spaces, and monitor their health. They had planned for this during the construction, storing massive quantities of grain, hay, dried fruits, and preserved foods. But managing it all required careful coordination and back-breaking work. The days blended together in a strange routine. Feed the animals, clean the pens, check the water supplies, maintain the ark itself, pray, sleep, repeat. But the psychological challenges were perhaps even harder than the physical ones. Imagine being one of only 8 humans left alive on Earth. Imagine knowing that every friend you had ever made, every neighbor you had ever known, every person who had ever lived outside your immediate family was gone. Forever. The silence was the worst part. After the rain stopped, exactly 40 days and 40 nights, just as God had promised. The quiet was deafening. No human voices carried on the wind. No sounds of civilization. No signs of life anywhere beyond the walls of their ark. Just water. Endless, empty water. Stretching to every horizon. Noah's wife struggled the most during those long months. She had left behind not just friends, but the graves of her parents, grandparents, and countless other worst-in people who were trying their best to cope with an impossible situation. Ham clashed with his father about rationing decisions. Japheth's wife struggled with claustrophobia in the confined spaces. Shem worried constantly about structural damage to the ark that could doom them all. But through it all, Noah remained steady, not because he was superhuman, but because he had learned to anchor his hope in God's character, rather than in his circumstances. Every morning, Noah would climb to the highest point of the ark and look out at the water covering the world, and every morning he would speak the same words. God remembers his covenant. He will not forget us. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The ark drifted wherever the currents took it, riding waves higher than mountains, surviving storms that would have destroyed any human-made vessel. But God's design held. The measurements he had given Noah proved perfect for the task. The materials he had specified were exactly right for the conditions. Every detail of the construction showed divine wisdom that human engineering could never have achieved. And slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the waters began to recede. It started with the rain stopping, exactly 40 days after it had begun. Then the fountains of the great deep stopped flowing. The supernatural sources of water that had flooded the world began to slow, then cease entirely. The Bible tells us that God remembered Noah, not because he had forgotten, but because it was time to act on his promise of salvation. If you're going through a season right now where you feel forgotten or abandoned, remember this truth. God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't feel that way to us. Hit that like button if you need this reminder tonight. A wind began to blow across the waters, not a destructive wind, but a wind of hope, a wind that would slowly but surely push the floodwaters back toward the seas where they belonged. Coming up, you'll experience the moment when Noah first realized their ordeal might be ending. You'll discover what it felt like to see dry land for the first time in over a year, and I'll reveal the first thing Noah did when he stepped off the ark, something that shows the true character of this remarkable man. But first, here's something to think about. For 150 days, Noah and his family were the only human
Change in the ark's movement. Instead of the constant rocking motion they had grown accustomed to, there was something steadier. Something that suggested land, he whispered, hardly daring to hope. He climbed to the uppermost deck and peered through the window that faced east. Nothing but water met his gaze, but the feeling persisted. Something had changed. Later that day, his suspicion was confirmed. The ark shuddered slightly and came to rest. Not the violent grinding of a ship running aground, but the gentle settling of a vessel, coming to rest on solid ground, far below the surface. They had landed on a mountain peak, Mount Ararat, though they wouldn't know its name for many years to come. The waters were still miles deep, but for the first time in over 5 months, they were no longer drifting aimlessly through an endless ocean. "We've stopped moving," Shem announced to the family that evening. There was cautious excitement in his voice, but also fear. What did this mean? Were they safe, or just trapped in a new way? Noah gathered his family for prayer that night, as he had done every night since entering the ark. But this time, his words carried a different weight. "The Lord has brought us to rest," he said. "We don't know what comes next, but we know who holds our future." Days passed. Weeks passed. The ark remained motionless, perched on its mountain peak like a wooden island in a world of water. But gradually, very gradually, the water level began to drop. It was Noah's wife who first noticed it. The window that had once been barely above the waterline now showed several feet of clearance. Each day brought a few more inches of exposed mountainside. "It's really happening," she whispered one morning, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to see land again." But the waiting was agony. Day after day, watching the water recede at a pace that seemed impossibly slow. They could see other mountain peaks beginning to emerge in the distance, like islands rising from the sea. But when would they be able to leave their wooden prison? The animals seemed to sense the change too. Birds became more restless, as if they could feel the approach of trees. Clear sky, but the raven never returned. Was that good news or bad? Had it found a place to land and decided to stay there? Or had it simply flown until exhaustion overtook it, becoming another casualty of the flood? They waited 7 days. Then Noah tried again. This time, he chose a dove. Doves were different from ravens. Gentler, more likely to return home if they didn't find what they were looking for. If the dove came back, they would know the land wasn't ready yet. If it stayed away, that might mean something else entirely. Noah's hands trembled slightly as he released the dove through the same window. The bird was so small, so fragile looking compared to the raven, but it flew with purpose, disappearing into the distance as the family watched and prayed. Evening came, then night, then morning again, and with the morning light came the sound of wings at the window. The dove had returned, but it carried something in its beak that made Noah's heart leap, a fresh olive leaf. "Look!" he called to his family, his voice cracking with emotion. "Green leaves! Plants are growing again!" It was the first sign of renewed life they had seen in almost a year. Somewhere out there, trees were putting forth new growth. The earth was healing. Life was returning to the devastated world. But the dove had returned, which meant it hadn't found a suitable place to land and stay. The world was recovering, but it wasn't ready for them yet. Noah waited another 7 days.
then sent the dove out once more. This time, evening came without the sound of returning wings. Night passed in hopeful silence. Morning arrived with no sign of the bird. The dove had found her new home. "It's time," Noah said simply. But even then, they waited, not from lack of faith, but from obedience. God had brought them into the ark, and only God could bring them out of it. Finally, after more than a year inside their wooden world, the voice they had been waiting for spoke to Noah's heart once again. "Come out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you."
Flight taught him something different about God's timing. What is God teaching you through the seasons of waiting in your own life? The smell hit them first. After more than a year breathing the recycled air inside the ark, that first breath of fresh, clean atmosphere was almost overwhelming. Noah stood in the doorway of their wooden sanctuary, his aged legs trembling as he prepared to step onto solid ground. The world spread out before them was both familiar and completely foreign. The basic landscape was recognizable: mountains and valleys, rocks and soil. But everything was different, scoured clean by the floodwaters, rearranged by forces beyond imagination. The world they had known was gone forever, replaced by something raw and new and full of potential. Noah's wife stood beside him, her hand clutching his arm for support. Behind them, their sons and daughters-in-law waited with a mixture of excitement and terror. They were about to become the parents of the new world. The responsibility was staggering. 8 people. That's all that remained of the human race. Every person who would ever be born from this moment forward would trace their ancestry back to this family, standing in the doorway of the ark. But they weren't alone. The animals were already beginning to emerge, species by species, pair by pair. Birds took flight with cries of joy that seemed to echo off the mountains. 4-legged creatures bounded down the ramp with energy that had been building for months. Even the insects buzzed with what seemed like excitement as they dispersed into their new world. And then Noah took his first step onto dry ground. His knees buckled, and he fell to the earth, pressing his face against soil that had been underwater for over a year, but was now solid and real beneath his hands. He wept, not from sorrow, but from overwhelming gratitude. They had survived. Against all odds, despite all the mockery, through all the terror and doubt and months of confinement, they had survived. But Noah's first act wasn't to explore their new world, or to begin planning where to build their new home. His first act was a covenant, a promise that, no matter how evil humanity might become in the future, God would never again destroy the world with a flood. But then God did something even more remarkable. He painted his promise across the sky. Noah and his family were exploring their new world, marveling at how different everything looked, when clouds began to gather. For just a moment, old fears returned. Was it going to rain again? Had they misunderstood? Was another flood coming? But instead of the torrential downpour they feared, a gentle shower began to fall. And as the sun continued to shine through the light rain, something appeared in the sky that none of them had ever seen before. A rainbow. Bands of color stretching across the heavens like a bridge between earth and sky. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Colors more brilliant than any earthly flower, more beautiful than any sunset. This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, God told Noah.
Whenever I bring clouds over the earth, and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Every rainbow that has ever appeared in the sky since that day has been a reminder of God's promise to Noah. Every time you see those bands of color after a storm, you're looking at God's signature on a contract he made with humanity over 4,000 years ago. But the new beginning wasn't without its challenges. 8 people trying to restart civilization is no small task. They had to figure out where to live, how to farm in soil that had been underwater for a year, how to raise livestock from the small breeding population they had preserved. They had to rediscover or reinvent countless skills and technologies that had been lost when the old world died. How to make tools, how to build permanent shelters, how to preserve food, how to make clothes. And they had to deal with the psychological trauma of being the sole survivors of a global catastrophe, the loneliness, the grief for all they had lost, the pressure of knowing that the future of the human race depended on their choices. No in the world around them. The problem was that it still existed within them. Drop a comment below if this story of new beginnings is encouraging you tonight. Sometimes we all need reminders that God is in the business of fresh starts. Coming up in our final chapter, you'll discover the mistake Noah made that changed everything for his descendants. You'll learn about the curse that divided humanity and the blessing that still shapes our world today. And I'll reveal why this ancient story still matters for your life right now. But first, here's something to consider. The rainbow was God's sign that he would never again destroy the world with water. But the Bible also tells us that next time the judgment will come by fire. Are we living in the calm before that storm? The signs are all around us. 10 years had passed since the ark's door had opened. Noah, now over 600 years old, had watched his family grow and spread across the renewed earth. His sons had children, and those children were having children of their own. The human race was slowly but surely multiplying again, just as God had commanded. The world was recovering too. Forests were regrowing. Rivers had carved new paths through the landscape. Animals that had once sheltered together in the ark now roamed free across continents, establishing territories and rebuilding the natural order. But Noah carried a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. He was the only person alive who remembered the world before the flood, the only one who had heard the voices of the drowning as the waters rose, the only one who understood the true weight of what had been lost and what had been saved. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Noah would walk to high places and look out over the valley where his family was building their new life. And he would remember. He remembered friends who had mocked his faith. He remembered neighbors who had thrown stones at his work. He remembered children who had grown up and grown old and died beneath the waves because they had chosen not to believe. The guilt was crushing at times. Could he have done more to warn them? Could he have found better words to convince them? Could he have somehow saved just one more person, one more family from the coming judgment? But then pride and rebellion. The hearts of people hadn't really changed. "And what do you think, my son?" Noah asked. Ham shifted uncomfortably. I think perhaps they're right. We're still so few in number. What if something happens to scatter us? What if we forget the lessons of the flood? Noah nodded slowly. He had been expecting this conversation for years. The survivors of the flood had been changed by their experience, but their children and grandchildren had not seen what they had seen. They had not felt the terror of divine judgment or the relief of divine mercy. To them, the flood was just a story their parents told, and like all stories told often enough, it was losing its power to shape behavior. The Lord scattered humanity once before, Noah said finally. If he chooses to do so again, no tower will stop him. Our job is not to make ourselves famous, but to remain faithful. But Noah's words carried less weight than they once had. He was old now, and the world was full of young voices, eager to make their mark on history. The Tower Project proceeded, and Noah watched with growing sorrow as his descendants repeated the same patterns of pride and rebellion that had led to the flood in the first place. And then came the day that changed everything. Noah had been working in his vineyard. He had discovered that grapes grew exceptionally well in the post-flood soil and had become skilled at making wine. Perhaps too skilled. The wine was stronger than he had realized, and Noah drank more than he should have. He fell asleep in his tent, and in his drunken state, he became uncovered and exposed. Ham discovered his father in this embarrassing condition. Instead of quietly covering Noah and saying nothing about it, Ham went and told his brothers about their father's shame, perhaps even mocking the great man of faith in his moment of weakness. When Shem and Japheth heard what had happened, they were horrified, not at their father's condition, but at their brother's disrespectful response. They took a garment, walked backward into the tent so they wouldn't see their father's nakedness, and carefully covered him. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, his response was swift and decisive. "Cursed be Canaan," he declared, referring to Ham's son. "He shall be a servant of servants to his brothers." But to Shem and Japheth,
Ham would indeed often find themselves in servitude, though this was not God's condemnation of any race, but the consequence of choices made by individuals. Noah lived 350 more years after the flood, dying at the age of 950. He saw his family multiply into tribes, then nations. He saw the Tower of Babel built and watched God confuse the languages and scatter the people across the earth, just as he had done once before. But through it all, Noah remembered the rainbow. Every time storm clouds gathered, and he feared another judgment might be coming, the bands of color would appear in the sky, reminding him of God's promise. Never again by flood. Never again would water destroy all life on earth. That promise still holds today. Every rainbow you see is a reminder that God keeps his word. Every storm that passes without destroying the world is evidence of his faithfulness to the covenant he made with Noah. But the rainbow also reminds us of something else, that judgment did come once, and the Bible tells us it will come again. Not by water next time, but by fire. Not to destroy creation, but to purify it and make it new. The story of Noah is ultimately a story about salvation, about God's patience with human sin, and his provision of a way of escape for those who will trust him, about the choice between the broad path that leads to destruction and the narrow door that leads to life. Noah's Ark wasn't just a boat. It was a picture of salvation itself. One door, one way in, one family chosen to carry the future of the world. And today, Jesus Christ offers himself as our ark, one door to safety from the judgment that is coming, one way to be saved from the flood of God's wrath against sin, one hope for a new beginning in a world made clean. The question that faced Noah's generation still faces ours. Will we listen to God's warning and enter his provision for salvation? Or will we ignore his voice and trust in our own strength until it's too late? If this story has spoken to your heart tonight, don't keep it to yourself. Share